Tonight, we are privileged to have one of the most distinguished and accomplished advocates of interreligious encounters in the world. Rabbi David Rosen is well known as the former Chief Rabbi of Ireland and the current International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee. He's typically introduced by citing his many writings and speeches, the fact that he is at the center of almost every really momentous conversation with Christian, Muslim, and other religious heavyweights. His vast experiences and his countless awards and degrees are oftentimes reviewed, and I assure you it would take a great deal of time to do that. Yet what makes him an especially fitting speaker for this occasion, our 25th anniversary, is simply the fact that he is a mensch with gravitas, someone that people trust almost automatically, someone who holds his own community to its highest standards and challenges the rest of us to live up to our own ideals. He also plays a mean piano, and we could turn to that if need be. So who better to help us take the pulse of interreligious relations, to help us gain a global perspective, and to help us better understand the risks and the opportunities that we face now and in the days to come. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi David Rosen.
Thank you for a very generous introduction, Chris. It is a particular joy, genuinely and sincerely, for me to be with you here this evening. I have had the benefit on one occasion in the past of participating in an ICJS program, and it's been too long before I've managed to get round to the second opportunity, but this is a very special opportunity to wish an institute of which I have admired and should be admired by the world with great appreciation for its contribution to the whole field of Jewish-Christian relations, to pay tribute on its 25th anniversary, and a special tribute to Reverend Chris Layton. Those of you who are not familiar, and I doubt whether that's anybody here, know that one of the most important milestones in the history of Christian-Jewish relations of our times was the issuing of the document Dabru Emet, and for that we have to thank this institute, without which it would not have happened. I must say that as significant as this was from a Jewish perspective, the degree with which that document was received by the Christian world surprised many of us who had perhaps no appreciation that there was such a degree of anticipation for something of its kind. So we have all around the world many debts of gratitude towards this institute. I would like to take this opportunity, though, to also make a personal thanks to the person who directed the AJC office here in Baltimore, to Lois Rosenfeld, because she was the one who made sure that I would be here at this time and make sure over the course of the last, I think it's 2 years that we planned it ahead, that any commitments that I had, and there have been many in the time, have been absolutely thrown out and rejected with insistence by her successors and other colleagues because of my prior commitment here. So thanks to all who have made sure that I'm here this evening. It is a great honor. I must take this opportunity to say that I am to be employed by AJC, the American Jewish Committee, to be its ambassador for Judaism to the religions of the world. It's my fantasy job, and I've got it relatively early enough to be able to enjoy it. My mantra is, you know, that I hope I'm making the world a better place, but even if I'm kidding myself, I'm having a hell of a lot of fun. And it is because of people, and I had just met the late Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum's sister here, great personalities who really were the pioneers in the history of the Jewish community's engagement in interfaith relations that has made the AJC the remarkable institution that it is, the remarkable organization with a pedigree absolutely unequaled. And as I say, despite my very British accent, it is the greatest honor to be able to be the representative of AJC in the world in terms of the work we do. I would also like to say that I was touched to discover, and I discovered it rather late in the day, that this lecture was in the memory of Bernie Manekin and his partner, neither of whom I knew. I didn't know the late Bernie Manekin, but I am very friendly. I have a lot of admiration for his son, Professor Charles Chip Bezalel Manekin, who unfortunately is not here. We didn't manage to synchronize our schedules very well in that regard. But I've picked up little things along the way, both in terms of the story of his involvement with the ICJS and little tidbits in terms of getting glimpses of his personality. And it's been very clear to me that this was a man of remarkable quality. And it's very clear to me that, even though I didn't know him, that this was a modest man, but Chris used the term Mensch very kindly. In my respect, from what I hear, this was really a paragon of Menschlichkeit, of true integrity and of remarkable devotion to humanity and revealing the best within the Jewish community. You know, our sages in the Talmud, when they talk of the question that we are going to be asked on the Day of Judgment, interesting enough, and something that perhaps a few rabbis need to be reminded of, do not say that God is going to ask us how well we kept the Sabbath, or how well we kept kosher, or how much we were devoted to the high holy days, or the festivals, or how many times we prayed a day. The question that we will be asked on the Day of Judgment is, did you live with integrity? Did you pursue a living honestly? And it seems, from what I have heard, as I say, in the little snippets of stories and of anecdotes, that this was a man who really exemplified that ideal in a remarkable, modest and dignified manner. So it is a very special honor for me to be able to speaking also in his memory on this particular occasion. The mandate that I've got from Chris has come in many different forms, and every time it seems to be bigger and bigger. And in fact, the questions he just posed are fabulous questions, and I hope that I will be able to still address them this evening, because it's impossible for me, within any kind of presentation, with any kind of logic that's going to have a continuity that makes sense, to be able to address them all. Because I am employed by AJC, so I'm in the States from time to time, and I discover that despite my very British accent, and even though I left England more than, 45 years ago, and have lived most of my life in Israel, and home is Jerusalem, even though I was, as you heard, rabbi in South Africa, it's important to me to tell you that I was kicked out of South Africa, expelled by the apartheid regime. And it was very exciting also to have been in Chief Rabbi of Ireland, the most fun rabbinic job in the world, but I'm not here to tell you about that. I discovered that despite the fact that I'm a product of British culture, it's when I'm here in the United States that I discover that the English language is expanding all the time. And I encounter words that I had never ever heard before. On one occasion, I was introduced as a well-known dialogian. I had never heard that word, dialogian. They explained to me a theologian who's involved in dialogue is a dialogian. Well, it's very nice, but in my experience, most so-called dialogians are actually monologians. And I would like to be able to prove that I'm a dialogian. So I have Chris's permission to be able to limit myself and that we will have plenty of time and opportunity to be able to discuss questions like those serious ones that he has raised, which I really would like to address as well, and many others, and any others that you would like to raise with me. And I hope I can prove that I'm a dialogian and not just a monologian, that we can have some fruitful exchange. And so please don't pull your punches when that comes. But because this mandate seemed so large, I am presuming to make my response on the question of Jewish perspectives on interreligious dialogue very personal. And I hope that you will not find it in any way problematic if I present these perspectives in terms of my own personal history and telling my story of how I got involved in dialogue and made this my passion as well as my profession, my vocation, and that I'm so deeply committed to, and raising certain issues along the way, both in terms of certain developments that we're involved in today, in many different dimensions. And I hope that this will touch upon a number of different points that will perhaps stimulate further conversation between us. I was a very young rabbi of a very large congregation in Cape Town in the 70s. It was actually a membership of 10,000 with 1,500 in synagogue on a Sabbath. And because in those days the local press, similar to the United States, was national press. There was no one national paper, or if you like, regional names cover national press, because there would always be journalists in my congregation as well. So perhaps I also got disproportionate attention. But during that time, that was the height of apartheid, of the iniquitous racial laws of the South African minority white regime. And it was obvious to me that I could only be in South Africa as if I was going to take a stand for social justice. It was obvious to me that that's what my religion and my faith required of me to do. But it was also clear that it was important for me to enable my community to be seen by other communities to be engaged in this process. And one of the few ways you could get people together across divides that were at one time called the color bar, and these iniquitous divisions, one of the few ways you could do so without running immediately afoul of the political authorities was through religion. So I came to interfaith relations actually out of a sense of commitment to social justice. And I started hawking my wares around to encourage the formation of an interfaith structure. In fact, we called it the Interfaith Forum, a council of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And as I met with the different religious leaders, this in itself was a fascinating experience for me. And I would put forward my proposal that, after all, religiously we have a responsibility to be able to come together, to be able to do something against the evils of the political system. And I wanted to form this interfaith framework, and generally speaking, the response was one with alacrity. Well, my opening gambit, you know, father, pastor, sheikh, the things that bring us together are so much more important than the things that divide us. They would all say yes, and to establish this Council of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. But I knew in the South African context, if I didn't have the Dutch Reformed Church involved, South African Dutch Reformed Church, it wouldn't be of enormous consequence. Why? Because the Dutch Reformed Church was the church of the ruling white minority. In fact, the minority power was politically known as the Nationalist Party, and often the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa was called the Nationalist Party at prayer. And so I sought to find an enlightened dominee, the Dutch word for a minister, who would be open to participating in some framework for interreligious dialogue. And I heard of a dominee downtown Cape Town who was having dialogue with Catholics. Now, that might not sound to you like a big deal, but anybody who knows Dutch Reformed Church demonology in South Africa knows that for the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, there were two great dangers. One was the Zwartgevaar, the black danger, and the other was the Roemse gevaar, the Roman Catholic danger. And if this guy was having a dialogue with Catholics, I thought maybe he'd be willing to talk to a Jew too. So I made this appointment to be able to meet with him, and I did that same opening gambit. You know, dominee, the things that bring us together are so much more important than the things that keep us apart. And to my surprise, I was young and very naive. He said to me, I have to do this with a heavy South African accent. Well, to tell you the truth, Rabbi, I cannot agree with you, because the most important thing in my life keeps us apart. My belief in Jesus as my personal redeemer. And to tell you the truth, Rabbi, anybody who does not share that is going to burn in hell. And I cannot meet with you, which you call dialogue, in other than to save you from hell. That is my Christian duty. So I said to him something which I don't know whether I really believed it at the time, but I certainly think now in retrospect it was very correct. I said to him, well, thank you, dominee, for your honesty. I still want you to come along to these meetings. I think it's important for me to understand you better. I would like you to understand me better. And I think we all need to understand one another better. But if you say that your responsibility is to be able to speak to me about your faith, I'm giving you the opportunity and you can't refuse it, otherwise you will be failing in your duty. And he did come, and he became less doctrinaire, if I could mix my denominational metaphors, less pontificatory, and he became more open and engaged and brought others in, and it was a very important lesson for me. It's very important for me to realize that I gained so much more by not taking offense and by not taking umbrage, and by continuing the conversation, that when you do manage to sustain it, and you do not allow your own insecurities or your own complexes or your own traumas to get the better of you, you can actually achieve so much more through that open encounter that we call dialogue. But the most important thing I discovered in this process as we started this Interfaith Forum was to discover how amazingly ignorant all these clergy were about me and my tradition and my heritage. And I naively assumed that Christians at least had some kind of understanding of Judaism, but the stereotypes and the misrepresentations were stunning. And I realized that it was terribly important that these people get to know me for what I think I am and the way I understand my heritage, and not the way they have misrepresented it. But as I got involved in that conversation, I realized, yes, they were terribly ignorant about me, but I was actually also profoundly ignorant about them. And I too was guilty of stereotypes and misunderstandings and misrepresentations. Not only was it my responsibility to know them for who they are, simply in order to be just and honest, to have integrity as to how I present them, but how could I expect them to know me if I didn't seek to know them? And therefore, dialogue in that sense of engagement was in my essential enlightened self-interest. It's been said that Jews and Christians come to dialogue out of different motives, and that's true. Any well-educated contemporary Christian will surely concur that it's impossible for a Christian to understand herself or himself without reference to Judaism at the very roots of his or her own identity. And Judaism does not have to relate to Christianity in order for us to understand ourselves. But nevertheless, if we do not understand one another, and if we do not seek to know one another, then it's very difficult for us to be truly known to one another. So dialogue, first and foremost, from a human perspective, but especially for a community that has experienced such prejudice and bigotry over the course of history, and remains everywhere except for in the state of Israel, where perhaps the challenges there are a little bit different, which I'll come back to later. A minority, wherever Jewish communities live, even in the vibrant, flourishing American context, has a strategic interest, necessity, imperative to be engaged in dialogue for its own well-being. But it's more than simply overcoming bigotry and prejudice. As I encountered people from different religious traditions, I realized something which I imagine for most of us here is obvious, but it wasn't for me then, and I was already this rabbi of this Orthodox congregation, young but still leading all these thousands of people. I realized what profound values we share, what enormously principal understanding of the sense of the divine of the world, that there is meaning to our existence, the divine presence in a human being created in the divine image, the sanctity of human life, the value of the family, the principles of justice, righteousness, the aspiration for peace. If we really believe in these things, then surely we have an obligation to work with others who say they believe in those. In fact, if we don't seek out others to work together with them for those values we espouse, in effect, we betray those values. Closing ourselves up in our own little ghetto and in insulation and isolation can often be very understandable when you have a history of insecurity and of victimization and you are vulnerable and you're caught up in your trauma. But it's not good for you. It's not good for you pragmatically, and it's not good for you in terms of the values that you want to advance. And above all, in these encounters, I realized that there was the higher goal of Jewish tradition and of Jewish commandment, which was to sanctify God, is to sanctify God's name in the world. And therefore, the way we do things and encounter one another and the way we strive for those goals is in fact a Jewish religious imperative. That's the way I see what I do, not as something exceptional, but as something that actually should be part and parcel of the fabric of every committed Jew's life, in order to be true, to testify to the divine presence in our history, in the life of our community, in the world at large. We are a very privileged generation, or I should say, we are privileged generations, to be able to live in this particular time when there's been such an amazing transformation. Sometimes we don't fully appreciate the enormity of it. I just give you one little anecdote to illustrate it, and it's within the Catholic context, but there could be so many parallels within other streams of Christianity. Of course, the fact that there is a hierarchical structure within Catholicism makes it sometimes much easier to be able to allude to it for some kind of paradigmatic, observational reference. But it was only a little more than a century ago that Theodor Herzl was hawking his wares around Europe to try to get support from the various leaders of the nations of that time for the Zionist enterprise. And just a year before he died, he records in his diaries of how he met with Pope Pius X. And very naively, Theodor Herzl didn't know too much about Judaism, he knew even less about Christianity. He thought that the Pope would welcome the Zionist concept, and he presented his plan, indicating that Zionism would help protect the interests of the Christian world for the protection of holy sites. And to his surprise, Pius X replied to him, "I cannot recognize you, for you have not recognized our Lord. I cannot prevent the Jews from returning to Palestine, but our priests will be ready with holy water to baptize them all." Now, Pius X wasn't a particularly unpleasant individual. Most popes wouldn't have even given Theodor Herzl the time of day. He at least graciously received him. He was simply responding according to what he understood to be normative Christian theology, based upon ideas already to be found in Justin Martyr and the Church Fathers, that the Jewish people had suffered the enormity of this tragedy of the destruction of the temple and the exile from their homeland, cast out amongst the nations, homeless and hated, because they had committed the ultimate sin, and that they had rejected the Christian dispensation, and that they had been replaced by the new Israel, the true Israel, the church. In fact, this understanding posed something of a theological dilemma, because if the Jews had now fulfilled their historical task and had now been replaced by the church, why did they survive at all in terms of the divine economy? And it was, if you like, the brilliant perception, almost the yeshiva education or the capacity for pilpul of St. Augustine that led to his interpretation that the Jews remain precisely in their homelessness and their vulnerability to prove what happens to you when you don't accept the Christian dispensation, and to remain an eternal witness until the end of time, when eventually their eyes would be opened. And therefore, Pius X was simply saying to Herzl, according to my theological understanding, you have absolutely no right to establish Jewish sovereignty for as long as you reject the Christian message. Now, the reason I tell you that story is simply to be able to show you what a dramatic era we live in. Today, we take it for granted that the Christian world is overwhelmingly our friend. And the Catholic Church has been led over the last two pontificates by popes who refer to the Jewish people as a dearly beloved elder brother of the church, of the original covenant, never broken and never to be broken. In fact, This was, of course, the language of John Paul II. Benedict XVI suggested that maybe it wasn't too good to describe the Jews as the elder brother, because if you read the Hebrew Bible, the elder brother normally gets the short end of the stick, because it's the younger brother who normally comes out better. So he suggested that maybe we should talk of Jewish parentage of the Christian tradition, which itself is a remarkable sensitivity, a reflection of it. And this, of course, comes out of the Second Vatican Council, of the document of Nostra Aetate that repudiated the idea of presenting the Jews as cursed or rejected by God, and affirmed the eternal nature of the covenant. And it was that facilitated the establishment of full diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the State of Israel, which I was privileged to be one of the little handful of people that negotiated, and that was a remarkably exciting moment to be able to do that. But that had been facilitated by this theological transformation. Today we take it almost for granted. And that rediscovered brotherhood and sisterhood between Christians and Jews is part and parcel of our fabric, especially in the United States. But there's the rub, especially in the United States. Why? Because Jews and Christians in the United States, all, even Christians, some Jews will be surprised to know, see themselves as minorities. And in reality, we are all minorities in the secular world. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But Jews and Christians in America all see themselves as committed to the fabric and the well-being of the society at large. And where we are minorities living alongside one another with a degree of vibrancy and commitment to the society at large, there you have the ideal sociological context for the internalization of this transformation on a theological level, from the Olympian heights down to the grassroots. But there are many places in the world where there are not dynamic Jewish communities, where Jews don't even feature on the radar screen, of where there is no awareness of the fact that traditional Christian teaching might be prejudicial or problematic, and where there is still the same also Jewish prejudice in response. And therefore there are significant challenges in the world at large. In my opinion, that's why, aside from any other reason, the election of a Latin American pope who has had such an intimate relationship with the Jewish community and is so committed to that relationship is so significant in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations. The reason I mention that the sociological context is important is not only to be able to say that America is not typical of the world at large, in case you didn't know, and not only to be able to say that there's plenty of work to do in the rest of the world and we shouldn't think, because things are so remarkable, and that you could have an institute like this Institute for Christian Jewish Studies, and in fact some 20 to 30 organizations under an umbrella of institutions of Christian Jewish Studies in the United States, when there's only maybe 1.5 in Europe, let alone anywhere else. That makes it so remarkable in the United States. But it's also the segue for me to be able to come to the one place in the world where Jews are the majority, and where the challenges, therefore, in some extent, are, to a degree, reversed. If, in many parts of Latin America, and in Africa, and in Asia, Jews don't even feature on the radar screen, for most Israelis, most Israeli Jews, Christians don't feature on their radar screen. And of course, most Israelis have never met a modern Christian. Even though we love to travel abroad, and we do so in disproportionate numbers, when we do so, we meet non-Jews as non-Jews, not as modern Christians. And therefore, in the course of our history, over the majority of the history of the State of Israel, Jewish perceptions of Christians have still been culled from the negative, tragic past. To a degree, this may even be compounded by the fact that the local Christian communities are, of course, Arab Christian communities, and even though the Arab Christians of Israel are loyal citizens of Israel, it's inevitable that in a situation of conflict, there is a certain degree of suspicion with regards to the Arab population on the part of the Jewish population, and to a degree even vice versa. So even the context, sociologically, culturally, politically, doesn't lend itself towards that internalization. And in Israel, of course, as I say, not only do most Jews never meet a modern Christian, they don't need to as a matter of course, in terms of their own daily life and encounter. And that is why, again, there was such enormous significance in the establishment of diplomatic relations between the State of Israel and the Holy See. Part of the irony is that the Catholic Church is also a state. for better and for worse, and perhaps many of us, perhaps a majority of us, might even think for worse. But nevertheless, what it means is that it's the only point of reference for Israel politically. And therefore, the absence of diplomatic relations for Israel and for the Jewish people, I suspect, was seen as perhaps a suspicion that maybe, if I could mix my religious metaphors, in the eyes of the church, Israel was not completely kosher. And that was why it was really important for those diplomatic relations to be established. And of course, John Paul II played an important role. But above all, those diplomatic relations paved the way for his visit in the year 2000. And it is quite remarkable that it was a pope from behind the Iron Curtain who understood intuitively the language of Madison Avenue, that you have to advertise through images to be able to get your messages across, especially in our times where people are doing less and less reading, let alone knowledge of documents. So there were some very important documents within Protestant churches, within the Catholic Church, that reflected this transformation. Most Jews, and probably most Christians, don't read documents or know about documents. But most Jews and most Christians do watch TV. They do watch television. And when John Paul II went to the synagogue in Rome in 1986 and embraced Rabbi Toaf and referred to the Jewish community as the elder brothers, that went around the world. But in Israel, we're still a little bit parochial. Like all societies are parochial. You always look at it through your own lens. What transformed Israeli perceptions and made them realize that there was a sea change in the Christian world at large was the visit of John Paul II to Israel in the year 2000. To see the Pope in tearful solidarity with Jewish pain and suffering at Yad Vashem, to discover as a result, as the papers were full of it, stories of how he saved Jews during the Shoah, above all, when he was a priest and a bishop, of how he returned Jewish children back to their natural parents against the wishes of their adoptive Catholic parents who had often had those children baptized. To see him at the Kotel at the Western Wall, putting there the text of a prayer of a church from a liturgy of forgiveness that he had conducted in St. Peter's 2 weeks earlier, asking God's forgiveness for all the terrible things done against the Jews down the course of history, that blew Israelis' minds. And that revealed to the community that there has been a sea change, a dramatic transformation. That the Christian world, even if not all the Christian world identifies with the Pope by any stretch of the imagination, but nevertheless, he personified what people began to understand, that the Christian world was not any longer an enemy. Not that there aren't elements within the Christian world that might be a little bit problematic, and not that my Dumini necessarily has changed his theology, but that generally speaking, the Christian world seeks to be a friend, an ally, and seeks to rediscover its brotherhood with the Jewish people. Amazing, as I say, historical transformation, an awareness of which was substantially galvanized. But even so, within certain segments of the Jewish community, there is a less of an interest in what goes on in the world at large. The more traditional a community is, generally speaking, unfortunately, the more self-obsessed it tends to be. And obviously, the more insecure it feels in relation to the modern world, the more it withdraws from the modern world, and therefore the less it knows about the realities in the modern world. When John Paul II visited Israel, he asked to meet with the chief rabbinate of Israel, with the chief rabbis and the chief rabbinate council. Now, I'm an Orthodox rabbi, but I would describe myself as a modern Orthodox rabbi. That means I'm comfortable in the modern world. That doesn't mean everything in the modern world is okay. I think we need to be selective about what's good and what's bad. But I don't see it as a threat to my existence as a Jew. And the cultural richness of modern society from around the world at large is what I want to embrace too, and to enrich my own Jewish identity with it, as I hope that I can contribute to its enrichment as part of world culture. But my colleagues within the chief rabbinate in Israel, I would describe as pre-modern Orthodox, as opposed to the ultra-Orthodox, which are anti-modern Orthodox. And the religious establishment in Israel, even though there are some notable exceptions, but generally speaking, is not interested in those that are different from themselves. The chief rabbinate of Israel doesn't have a committee for dialogue with other kinds of Jews. But when the Pope came along and asked to be able to establish a bilateral dialogue with the Catholic Church, they had never even thought of such a thing. But when a Pope asks you, it's rather difficult to say no. And if I can once again, if you'll excuse me, getting back to my own personal journey, one of my other mantras that I like to bandy about is that I am the beneficiary of other people's ignorance and other people's absence. So I mentioned that I was part of the team that negotiated the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and the Holy See because the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is generally made up of people who think they know everything about everything, like most diplomats, nevertheless, perhaps in one area that they might admit that they don't know something about is religion. And a recognition that on the other side of the table were not only diplomats and legal experts, but men of the cloth, and therefore it would be a good idea if on the Jewish side there was somebody who at least knows the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant, if not between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. So as a result, I'm brought in to the team that negotiated the process. When the Pope asked these rabbis in the Chief Rabbinate Council under the Chief Rabbis to establish a bilateral commission, you can imagine how startled they were. And then they need to find a rabbi who at least knew what he would be doing within this area. So as a result, I am the honorary advisor of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. It's not an institution of which I have an enormous affection for, nor do I think it's necessarily enormously productive, even for the interests of orthodoxy, let alone of general religiosity or of the Jewish unity in the world at large. But Providence has placed me in this particular position of where I've been able to push even those who are of a pre-modern mentality into this particular engagement. And you know, this engagement has been good even in terms of Jewish pluralism, not good enough, but it's certainly opened up the minds of these rabbis to a broader perspective and a broader engagement. Chief Rabbinate now of Israel has an annual dialogue with the Vatican. There's this Vatican Chief Rabbinate Commission that meets once every year, 1 year in Rome, 1 year in Jerusalem. As a result of that, we also have now an Anglican Jewish Commission, 1 year in Canterbury or Lambeth Palace, 1 year in Jerusalem. And it's also contributed not only to closer relationships with the Arab Christian population, but even with the Muslim population. We now have in Israel a Council of Religious Institutions of the Holy Land. There's a council made up of the Palestinian Sharia courts, the Ministry of Waqf of Religious Affairs of the Palestinian Authority, all the patriarchates of Jerusalem, which other than the Greek Orthodox and the Armenian and the bishoprics, Greek Orthodox and the Armenian are the only ones that are not Arabs, the rest are all Arabs, and a Chief Rabbinate of Israel and its delegation. And this council has 3 goals: to keep open avenues of communication between the different religious leaders, to combat incitement and defamation. Unfortunately, there have been many attacks of religious institutions, and it's not only condemned by the council, it has a website which is made of the initials CRIHL, Council of Religious Institutions of the Holy Land, where you can see these condemnations, and even the religious leaders coming together, where there are attacks, to be able to show solidarity with the different communities. And the last goal, declared by all the religious leaders, is to help support political initiatives to bring an end to the conflict in the Holy Land so that 2 nations and 3 religions may flourish in the land that's holy and precious to them all. That's quite counterintuitive. Most people in the world would not believe that the religious leaders have signed on such a document. Probably even most Palestinians and Israelis wouldn't believe it. But that is the reality that has come out of a certain dynamic which in many respects are the fruits of the transformation of Jewish-Christian relations. And I think I can say without fear of contradiction that none of those things would have happened had the transformation not taken place in our times in terms of Jewish-Christian relations. So let me conclude my monologue before I'm in danger of proving that I'm a monologian and not a dialogian by referring to well-known, in fact probably his comment is also well known to you, of the great Christian theologian of blessed memory, the Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm, and before that the Dean of the Divinity School in Harvard, Krista Stendahl, who had his famous 3 rules for dialogue. 2 have been implicit, explicit in my comments about my own personal journey. One was, always try to understand the other the way the other understands herself or himself, and not the way third parties present them. The second is always look at the other community by the best within it. Don't judge it by the worst within it. But his third rule is a very special and unusual insight. And it's one that's been really a great joy and continues to be a great joy for me. Wherever I am, even in difficult political circumstances in the Middle East, even when I'm interacting with the religions of the Far East, and certainly when I'm involved in the renewed relationship between Christianity and Judaism. And indeed, as I encounter the Muslim world, which from an existential point of view is perhaps the most pressing and challenging of all the interreligious encounters of our times for the Jewish community. His third rule is, leave room for holy envy. It's a beautiful concept. It's very nice when we meet and you say, you do that, we do that. Yes, we have that in common. That's very nice. It's very nice to be able to feel a sense of connectedness and of commonality and of shared values. But it's no disloyalty to your tradition to be able to say there is something very beautiful in that tradition that's very special to that tradition, and to be able to celebrate it. And that's the remarkable thing of the era in which we live. And it's the remarkable thing that today Jews and Christians and Muslims and all who choose to can today live in a world in which we can celebrate one another. This doesn't mean that there aren't dangers, and this doesn't mean that we don't have to do things necessary to protect ourselves. But there has never, ever been in the history of humanity more interreligious encounter, more interreligious scholarship, more interreligious cooperation across all the different divides than ever before. And this is something which, on this occasion of this Institute's 25th anniversary, that we have to give great thanks to God for. So on that note, I will conclude my monologue and be very happy for you to take me off into dialogue wherever you think I have not gone, or whether you'd like to go in a little bit detail, or any of the wonderful questions that Dr. Layton posed in his very generous introduction. Thank you.